Thank you for coming. My name is Joanna Hahn, and I'm in my 8th year as site manager here at the Levi and Catharine Coffin State Historic Site, and happy tonight to present our Women's History Month program, Women in the Underground Railroad. We've been doing this for a few years, but over the last 4 to 5 years, I've been working to try to highlight the role of women in the Underground Railroad. Now, last year, I highlighted Catharine, obviously. She got the stamp last March. It's been a year since her stamp's been out. But this year I really wanted to sort of go in a different direction and maybe look at a little deeper in Levi Coffin's book, Reminiscences, and focus on a few stories of the female runaway slaves, freedom seekers, that spent time with the Coffins, and kind of looking at some insight into the female experience with the Underground Railroad and with escaping slavery and their encounters and finding freedom. So for me, there's a common thread, and I think anyone, especially a female and mother, is going to see that common thread in these stories and experiences, that often freedom that they sought was not just for themselves, but for the people that were most important to them in their lives. So I have 4 specific stories. I think I'm going to go around 45 minutes. I am suffering from a slight cold, and I apologize. I may have to take a break and drink some water periodically. And then at the end, I'm happy to open it to questions and see if there's questions that you have about these individuals. Plus, with doing this gives me an opportunity to really dig deeper to some of the people that are in Coffin's book. You know, he left us somewhat of a record of their lives and who they were, and what more can we do to share those stories and learn more about them. So I really hope this program helps to do that. So the first individual that I'm going to speak to, I do not know what just happened. There we go. I'm speaking of a woman, I believe it's pronounced Eid. There's a different spelling we'll see a little later of E-A-D in a historic document. This is how it's spelled in Levi's book, so I think I might be pronouncing it wrong, or correct, I'm sorry. Now, as Levi speaks in his book, Reminiscences, Eid was the property of a neighbor of the Coffin family, this man right here, in New Garden, North Carolina, Dr. David Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell, along with several of his brothers, owned hundreds of acres of farmland in and around the New Garden area. The Coffins knew Dr. Caldwell's family well. Levi himself speaks to his family attending corn husking parties at the Caldwell's farm, showing that the Coffins' relationship with the Caldwell family as friendly. Besides being a prominent farmer, Dr. Caldwell was a self-trained physician who served during the American Revolution. He was also an ordained Presbyterian minister, establishing several churches in Guilford County, was a delegate of the state's Constitutional Convention, and established supposedly the first college in North Carolina, which was known as Log College, was sat near his farm in New Garden. So in essence, David Caldwell was a well-respected and well-known individual, but he was also a slave owner. So if we were to, I love maps when it comes to the Underground Railroad. Some of us have studied, we're fascinated by maps, but just to kind of give you an idea, this is about the best I can give of sort of a map view of this area that today is Greensboro, North Carolina. And so modern day Greensboro is where historic New Garden would have sat. So the circle to the right, if you can see that little red dot on this Google map, actually shows where the Caldwell farm was located. And then the circle on the left actually encircles what today is Guilford College, which would have been in and around where the Coffin family lived. So these were back then your neighbor was could be a mile or 2 apart, but that was your neighbor, right? But as I said, these are 2 families that seem to have known each other well. Caldwell's farm is now a historic park in Greensboro, North Carolina. The house that you see pictured there is in that historic park, was built in 1781, and most likely this is a building that Ede would have been familiar with. We don't know exactly what type of work Ede did when she was enslaved by the Caldwells, so she could have been working in the Caldwell family home. She could have been perhaps used as labor in the college. We're not quite sure. And then the picture next to that is of some of the gardens that are part of the historic park. And I believe there's also a working mill on the property as well. We know that much of the slave labor either was working on the farm itself, which then a lot of enslaved women in North Carolina worked both in the home and on the farm. So that's something Ede could have been experiencing, or possibly also supporting this college that I had mentioned before. Some biographers paint Dr. Caldwell as being an individual who disagreed with the practice of slavery. His family still profited, though, from the ownership and labor of enslaved Africans such as Ede. The 1810 census shows he held 16 individuals in bondage, which would have included Ede. Though I'm unsure of exactly when the story takes place, Levi does not do a good job of giving us dates for a lot of the stories, okay? But he was still kind of young. I would say probably in his early mid-teen years. So I think that this story may have happened sometime between 1810 and 1820. As Levi tells the story of Ede, Dr. Caldwell's son, Samuel, had married, and it was decided by Dr. Caldwell to gift one of his slaves to his son and new daughter-in-law, who planned to set up a home in Charlotte. Ede was to be that gift. According to Levi, Ede was the mother of 4 children, one which is still young and would remain with Ede when they go to Charlotte. Ede was also attached to a male slave owned by another person, someone she saw as her husband. But Dr. Caldwell was not concerned, as he thought Ede would not miss him, as slave marriages were not considered legal or binding. But Ede wished not to be separated from her other children in a life she had in New Garden. The area where Dr. Caldwell and the Coffins had their farms was thickly wooded. Levi mentions often finding runaway slaves when tending to hog the pasture in the woods. Ede herself recognized its usefulness, and on the night before the departure for Charlotte, Ede took her young baby to the wood to hide. Ede did her best to care for her infant, with no access to heat on chilly nights and only the food she had brought to curb hunger. So it was only a few days before the child became ill and the food she had that was gone. Though desperate to care for her child, Ede chose not to give in and return to the Caldwell homestead. She instead arrived at the door of the home of Levi and Prudence Coffin, who are our Levi's parents. Ede was aware of the Coffin family and their friendliness towards slaves and felt, being neighbors, they could assist with her situation. The Coffins knew, though, by taking Ede in, that they could be charged with a heavy fine. But Levi's mother, Prudence, insisted it was important to attend to the child that Ede had with her. But what could be the next step in aiding Ede? Ede was not interested in leaving New Garden. She felt her place was with her family, but begged not to be returned to the Caldwells. As Levi puts it, quote, as she repeated her sad story, the tears streamed down her cheeks, and she said she would rather die than be separated from her family. Levi volunteered to speak to Dr. Caldwell on Ede's behalf to try and convince him not to take Ede away from her family. Levi also hoped by going directly to Dr. Caldwell, he could potentially keep his family from facing any legal penalty. In his reminiscences, Levi seems nervous in approaching Dr. Caldwell, even though they were acquainted. Rachel Caldwell, Dr. Caldwell's wife, was also in the room during Levi's visit, and after some small talk, Levi broached the topic of Ede's disappearance. Caldwell admitted to knowing that Ede had disappeared because of the decision to send her to Charlotte. Levi spoke of how Ede had come to his family, sharing how the family cared for Ede and her sick child. But Levi felt that appealing to Dr. Caldwell as a minister, using scripture from the Bible, allowed him a chance to see Ede's situation more clearly. But it was not Dr. Caldwell that Levi's testimony affected first. It was Rachel Caldwell. She spoke out that she was against the idea of Ede going to Charlotte when it was first suggested, and we can see that was her understanding of Ede as a mother, Rachel herself being a mother, what Ede's feelings of being forced away from her family was to Ede. Being a mother herself, she would have understood Ede's being so against the decision. Seeing that his appeal was working, Levi noted to the Caldwells that Ede would return if they promised to let her stay, but he was very forceful in making sure that they understood if she was going to be forced in this move to Charlotte, she would rather die. Dr. Caldwell remained silent. To gain some sort of understanding of his feelings, Levi asked Dr. Caldwell if he believed Levi's father had done the right thing by taking Ede and the child in, even though it violated the law. "Your father has done right," Dr. Caldwell replied, and went further to say he would promise not to have Ede sent away. Later that day, Ede and her child returned to the Caldwell household, and Levi's last line in the story is the doctor kept his promise. But did he really? How long does a promise really last when you have human beings seen as property, right? So there's not much we can know of Ede's life. Really, Levi's story is one of the few records that we have of her existence and who she was, that she was a mother. The only other record that I've been able to find is Dr. Caldwell's will. He's going to pass away in 1824. This will was written in 1822, just a few years before. So did he keep his promise? In this particular section, which I'm sure is not easy to read, so I can't do better than that, but I can read to you that it says, "The following property is to be disposed of in the family, if convenient, if not to strangers. The Negro Tom, Joe, George, Tim, Ede, Charles," and then there are two names that are illegible that I haven't been able to read, but I think the first letters are V and B. So right there, the red arrow is pointing to where Ede's name is listed. So upon Caldwell's death, the executor of his estate had the power to disperse his slaves to any family, and if they were not willing to take the slaves, to anyone outside of the family. Dr. Caldwell's promise only extended to the end of his life, which for Ede appears to perhaps have only been maybe another 5 to 10 years after what I think Levi's story takes place. So she was either possibly sold or given as property to another party. And perhaps in that transaction, separated from those that she loved most. So Dr. Caldwell's decision only delayed what probably was going to be the inevitable for Ede. So I can't speak if any of the male names listed here happen to be any of her children. So unfortunately, I don't have those names, but it's possible one or two of them could be. So, and that's what we know of Ede. All right, Eliza Harris, who's probably one of Levi's more well-known stories. Of any freedom seeker aided by the Coffins, Eliza's story is one that transcends history books and lit a spark for anti-slavery fervor in the 1850s. It also is a story that leapt from the pages of a book to be told in a variety of mediums. Eliza's story is forever tied to the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which originally was first published as short stories and then as a full book in 1852. And because of that association, Eliza's story continues to be one of the most memorable, both from Levi's book and of course from Stowe's book as well. Like Ede, Eliza was concerned about staying with her family. When looking at historical sources, there are those who recount Eliza's story with varying detail. What I will speak to here is first what Levi details in his book Reminiscences, and then a little later, I'll be looking at references from a book called Beyond the River by Anne Hagedorn, which is one of the few nonfiction published accounts of the real Eliza's harrowing journey. It was February 1838 when Eliza learned that her enslaver, a man in debt, planned to sell her child. Like Ede's story before, Eliza's need to remain with her child will cause Eliza to take action. Eliza was enslaved in Dover, Kentucky, and so here we go in with maps and red circles, so hopefully this makes sense, okay? So the circle to the left is circling around what today is Dover, Kentucky. So I don't know if she was enslaved to a family living in the town. Most likely is probably a farmer living on the outskirts, but Dover, Kentucky is where she's considered from. It was a small farming community just miles from the Ohio River. And like many in that region of the Upper South, Eliza knew that the other side of the river could mean freedom. Escaping with her child at night after her enslavers went to bed, she headed north towards the river. The recent change in colder weather meant the river should be frozen for an easier yet still risky crossing into Ohio. But once reaching the bank, she found the ice was broken into sheets. Crossing without getting wet would be impossible. Eliza chose to go to a nearby occupied home to ask for shelter, but it was not long before a group of men were heard outside, presumably looking for the two escaped slaves. Eliza bolted with her child to the river. Levi claims Eliza did not hesitate to head into the water, driven by the idea that she would rather see herself and her baby drown than be taken alive. With adrenaline directing her actions, Eliza jumped from ice cake to ice cake, some wavering and succumbing to her weight. Eliza did her best to keep her child out of the freezing water, but at times, Eliza was waist deep in the water, clinging to the ice to pull herself back up again. Eliza and her child reached the other side, but due to exhaustion in the freezing water, chose to rest for a short time on the shore, trying to recover her wits for her next move. As Levi puts it, a man witnessed her crossing, approached Eliza, and directed her to a home on a bluff overlooking the river. So where she ended up crossing, and I'll show another map here in a moment, well, that red circle to the right is encircling what is Ripley, Ohio. So she did not necessarily go very far, but you can imagine that toll it took just going that short distance just because she had to cross the river. Now, the home that she was told is on a bluff overlooking the river. And so I don't know if you can read, but it says the John Rankin house there. Regardless of the climb ahead of her, Eliza kept moving, eventually reaching the door of the home of Presbyterian minister and Underground Railroad Station manager John Rankin. The Rankin home was a busy one, with its position overlooking the Ohio River, where the Rankin family often saw crossings like Eliza's. Eliza was brought into the Rankin home and placed near a fire, given food and dry clothing. But the Rankins knew she could not linger, as it would not be long before her pursuers found a way to cross. Within days, Eliza and her child were brought to Newport, which is Fountain City today, and to the Coffin home. Eliza remained with Levi and Catharine for several days, and during this time, Eliza recounted her escape to the couple. Soon, a few more freedom seekers had arrived, and Levi determined it was safe to take them all to the nearby Greenville settlement, which today is Longtown, Ohio. From there, Underground Railroad operatives moved her north to Sandusky, Ohio, where she eventually crossed into Canada by boat. In 1854, Levi and Catharine made a tour of Western Ontario, reuniting with several former slaves they helped escape. It was at a church when a woman approached them, noting she was the Eliza they had helped over a decade before. In fact, Levi goes on to say that along with Eliza's recounting her memories of the Coffins, she also mentioned that it was the Coffins that actually gave her the name Eliza Harris. At the time, Eliza lived in Chatham, where Levi said she had a comfortable home. Author and historian Anne Hagedorn, who I mentioned before, wrote this book called Beyond the River, which I highly recommend. She confirms much of the story the Coffin tells, but she does some fact-filling, because that's another thing Levi does. There's a lot of facts that maybe he just didn't know them, and that's fine in understanding. But she fills in some of the details of Eliza's escape. For instance, local historical records note that Eliza's escape must have happened post-February 22nd in 1838, as that is when the river was last reported to be frozen. Another was that the man who sheltered her actually provided a rail, just a large piece of railing from a fence for her crossing, for her to use. So that way, if she did fall in, hopefully it would catch the ice and she wouldn't submerge completely. Hagedorn also claims that Eliza's crossing happened at the mouth of Red Oak Creek, and this is another map, but right in Ripley is where Red Oak Creek is. So I did my best to use this arrow pointing kind of where the creek hits the river. And the creek basically follows what is today US 62, where it says Red Oak Presbyterian Church. That was actually the next stop the Rankins took her to. Okay, so we have a little bit of an understanding of some of the locations Eliza spent some time in. Most of these locations, Ohio, she did not spend very long, just because of how most likely hotly pursued she is going to be, which is a big reason Levi says it was decided to take her into Indiana in hopes that that might throw off the trail of those searching for her. So Hagedorn also claims that Eliza's crossing happened at the mouth of Red Oak Creek. Okay. One specific detail that Anne speaks to is that when Eliza reached the Ohio side, she was met by a man known as Chauncey Shaw. So the historical records actually name the person who met her on the Ohio side. A slave catcher who patrolled the banks of the river at night, hoping to capture escaped slaves like Eliza. However, after witnessing what Eliza accomplished, Shaw felt she had earned her freedom and gave her directions how to find the Rankin home. I mean, it was well known that the Rankins are doing very much what the Coffins were doing here in Newport. So he knew where to send her up the bluff to the Rankins. The source that Anne uses for Eliza's story is the reminiscences of John Rankin's son, John Jr. He confirms that Eliza's visit to the Rankins was not a long one, as the family felt she had to be moved to the next station right away. John and another Rankin brother led Eliza and her child to the home of Presbyterian minister James Gilliland, which I mentioned. He is the minister at Red Oak Presbyterian Church. So a distance between Ripley and Red Oak was 6 miles. Eliza continued to be moved through southwestern Ohio, and as I said, then it was decided to take her into Indiana. It is important to note that if Eliza's escape happened in the later days of winter 1838, then she did not spend time under the roof of the home that is currently part of the site, because that house was not built until 1839. But it would have been in the Coffin's first home, which most likely was down the street on the main crossroads. John Rankin is credited with giving details of Eliza's escape across the Ohio River to Harriet Beecher Stowe. There are some here in town in the years after the Coffins moved away to try to claim that Harriet Beecher Stowe came here and learned about Eliza's story here. But there is no record that Harriet Beecher Stowe ever came to Fountain City, Indiana. So, and even one of her children said she never went to Fountain City, Indiana. So, not sure why someone decided, let's start that rumor, but that's kind of how some of these things with Eliza's story have developed over the generations. I'm sure Stowe hoped her use of real events and individuals would stir feelings in the hearts of her readers, but I cannot imagine that Stowe could have been prepared for the reaction to come when Uncle Tom's Cabin published. Stowe's true depiction of slavery, which included escaped slaves being hunted, the separation of enslaved parents from their children, and even the killing of a slave, awakened many in the North on the conditions many slaves lived in. It became so popular that Southerners demonized the book, calling it inaccurate and not a true reflection of slavery. Not all Americans experienced the stories from the book through the reading, but through play adaptations and images that try to depict scenes from the book. It became such a cultural phenomenon that puzzles, games, chinaware, decorative prints, even children's books, like what you see here. This is a children's version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the cover of. Posters, sheet music, plays, which posters for plays or scripts for plays. And then even so popular that in 1951, when Rodgers and Hammerstein debuted their King and I musical, there's a whole scene dedicated to recreating Eliza's crossing from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Many use racial stereotypes in their depictions of characters, and blackface was common when the play was performed before audiences. But many of these images that recreate Eliza's escape across the river actually hold many of the same elements. So here are 3 different ones, but you can see there's a lot of similarities. It's interesting. It's that this one moment of Eliza's journey, this is the one that they always focus on. There's always the image of Eliza carrying her child, and there's some unknown of how old the child really was. I think if I remember right, Levi gives this impression the child could have been close to the age of 1 or 2. Some tried to give the impression it was a newborn or a young baby. Obviously, her crossing the broken ice in the river. Generally, there's always figures of a man or a group of men behind her, sometimes with dogs. And then there's always this thought, let's have Eliza looking behind her, right? In this moment to see, am I leaving them behind? Who's behind me? What's behind me? All of this is a reminder of the sacrifice and risk Eliza is making, going from one side of a river where slavery thrives to the other side, which provides an open door towards freedom. Such imagery provides a feeling of hope, but in a way, an image like this is meant to further enrage those in the North. I've not seen an image created that actually depicts Eliza experiencing the other side. Right? It's always this particular moment. Regardless of the hope this image provides, we must remember that Eliza still was not safe once she made it to the other side. She could take her chances staying in the North, but even Levi recognized it was not safe to stay for long, and like many, her journey to freedom ended in Canada. So Eliza is one of those few where we sort of have a beginning and an end, right? We have like a bookend to her life, unlike Ede, which we don't quite have. Now, my next story is focused on a woman known as Rachel. Now, there's been some debate if the Coffins really knew the names of the people they helped. I talked about Eliza getting her name from the coffin. So there's a belief that perhaps when freedom seekers came under the coffin's care, they didn't want to know the names of the people they were helping. They may provide a pseudonym, something they can go by while they were there. And perhaps if they did provide Eliza's name, she thought, well, that'll just be my new name as a free woman. This next person, I'm not quite sure. Again, if this is her given name as a slave, if this was a name adopted by her, but we'll probably never have an actual answer. With the stories Levi Coffin has left us, we can see how the Coffins developed strong relationships with some of the freedom seekers they aided, such as the person I'm speaking to next, as Rachel. Now, in the book, Levi calls her Aunt Rachel, a title that no other freedom seeker or Black individual that the Coffins knew hold within his memoir. So before I go into her story, I do want to address this title before her name. Though it is not sure where the practice of using the term began, it was a term used during the antebellum period to reflect a motherly Black woman who served an important function for a family of which she was not related, but whose inferiority did not deserve the use of her given name. So while I am speaking of her story, I'm going to refer to her as Rachel. There'll be one quote from Levi where I will reference her as Aunt Rachel, and that's just because I want to be true to the quote. Rachel and her children were enslaved to an older white couple in Lexington, Kentucky. Levi portrays Rachel's situation in the family as happy. Rachel was also married to an enslaved man who was the property of a nearby family, and they were allowed to visit often as a family. But the happiness did not last. In time, Rachel's husband passed, and several years later, the couple who owned Rachel and her children also died. The result was the enslaved family being put up for public sale. Rachel's children were sold to families in Lexington, but Rachel was sold to a Southern slave trader who then took her down to Mississippi to resell her. Once in the state of Mississippi, Rachel was sold to a cotton plantation owner. Her situation was one greatly feared by slaves in the Upper South. The harsh labor, along with the grueling weather conditions and the inhumane treatment, were well known by those enslaved in Kentucky, and especially saw a situation like Rachel's as a death sentence. Rachel did her best to keep up with the required work, which was a far cry from running a household. It was not long before Rachel faced repercussions about her inability to meet her daily quotas, leading her to be starved. It is not known how long Rachel endured these conditions before deciding to escape. Rachel made the goal to reach Lexington. I can't imagine. You are somewhere in Mississippi. She may not even know if she's in Mississippi, but somehow she thinks she can get herself to Lexington. There is no Underground Railroad to look to. There is nobody to help her. So her hope is to reunite with her children in Lexington, which I would assume she understood the undertaking before her, as I just mentioned, not knowing so many unknown variables. Levi quotes Rachel as saying, "It is death to stay here. I had rather died in an attempt to get away." So again, some of these recurring themes. Rachel's escape took place in the early summer, giving her the advantage of mostly scavenging for food nature provided. Though the journey surely took weeks to maybe months, Rachel arrived in Lexington. After trusting a friend to conceal her, Rachel worked to find her children, but it was not easy. Rachel used her connections with Blacks in Lexington to try to speak to white enslavers about purchasing her. So she's hoping she can talk somebody into making a deal, allowing her to stay in Lexington. But nobody agreed because nobody was willing to take on someone that they knew was a fugitive slave. As for finding her children, that part was not hard. Rachel spoke about how one day while concealed, she saw one of her children playing in the yard at a home next door. Though it surely broke Rachel's heart, she dared not contact her children until the time was right. It was not long before things became too dangerous. Word got out of Rachel's presence in the city, and it was not long before her enslaver from Mississippi arrived in Lexington, arranging for the search of houses. And before Rachel could be secreted through the Underground Railroad, that was the hope. Help her reunite with her family, get her connected with the Underground Railroad, get her out of Kentucky. She was caught and jailed. Her hands were manacled and a heavy ball and chain placed on one ankle. She remained in jail for a week with these words from her enslaver going, I'm sure, over and over in her mind, where he says he would have his pay out of her when he got home. He would double her task, and if she did not perform it, he would cut the hide off of her with his whip. When it came time to leave, Rachel was placed in the back of a wagon. They traveled north toward Louisville to board a boat and then traveled down the Ohio River to the Mississippi River. But as night came and Rachel was left on watch, she grabbed the heavy ball and chain and jumped from the wagon into a nearby ravine. A search ensued, yet no one tried to search the nearby ravine. After the noises of her pursuers disappeared, Rachel took off in the night. The nights, though, were not the same as the nights that she had during her first escape, because fall has set in. So even though the nights are longer, they are also colder. Nature was not as plentiful with providing food, and along with those challenges, she was not getting far with the ball and chain and the manacles. Her ball and chain was dealt with when Rachel arrived at a stream with large rocks. By positioning the rocks just right over the chain connected to the iron ball, she was able to use her strength to break the links. But the cuff remained on her ankle and the manacles on her wrist. One cold night, Rachel stayed warm by finding a large group of hogs and shooing them away, and then sleeping in their sleeping spot because she knew she would be warm that way. But she eventually would need food. The cuff on her ankle was starting to chafe, creating an open sore and may soon become infected. Rachel took the chance to rely on the mercy of others and soon found a home of a Black family who assisted with removing the manacles from her wrists and provided her with food. So obviously, she feels more comfortable reaching out to individuals, Black individuals in the state of Kentucky, when she wouldn't have been able to find that help in Mississippi. They also gave her instructions on how to get to the Ohio River and onto Madison, Indiana. And with the help of others who provided transportation, directions, and even eventual removal of the iron cuff on her leg, Rachel crossed the Ohio River into Indiana. She aimed to find a Black settlement near Madison, which may have been the settlement of Graysville that founded in 1821. She was taken in by a Black farmer who she tended house for until slave catchers came to the area. The Underground Railroad then came to Rachel's assistance, and eventually she found herself in the home of Levi and Catharine Coffin. Most likely, Rachel's time with the Coffins happened in the year 1836, so this would have predated Eliza's story by 2 years. This can be determined when Levi remembers having a reunion with Rachel in 1844 and mentions the last he saw her was 8 years prior. Levi claimed Rachel was with the family for around 6 months, the Coffin family, and perhaps was the longest freedom seeker to spend time under the Coffin's roof. Levi reflects, "We soon found her to be one of the best housekeepers and cooks we had ever employed. She was careful and trustworthy and exemplary in all her ways. We became much attached to her, and indeed the neighbors and all who knew her had a great deal of respect and liking for Aunt Rachel." Rachel remained with the Coffins until, like before in her time in Madison, slave catchers from Kentucky came to the area. With a trunk and new clothing provided by the Coffins, Rachel went north with local Quakers who were on their way to Young's Prairie, Michigan. After that, Rachel settled in Canada. When Levi speaks of the reunion in 1844 during his trip to Canada, he notes that Rachel had remarried and perhaps an intent to restart her life. Levi provides more information about Rachel than most of the female freedom seekers in his book. Most likely, Rachel's impressions on the Coffin family, with her length of stay, made it easier for Levi to give more detail than with many of the other stories of those who only spent hours or several days with the Coffins. So Levi, when he wrote his reminiscences, it published in 1876. So he is writing this a decade after the Civil War has ended. And this, of course, if we know that her story was happening in 1836, 40 years after he met her. So my point being, the length of stay that Rachel had with the Coffins, it was easier for him to go back to those reminiscences of his and really tell us more about Rachel than with some of the other females that spent time with the Coffins. One aspect that can be gleaned from Rachel's experience is just what it took for a long-distance escape. It was not often the Coffins encountered a slave who made a journey as long as Rachel's. Most of the stories provided by Levi focus on those who escaped from Kentucky. We can try and imagine how Rachel was able to successfully find her way north through hundreds of miles of slave territory before making it to Lexington. Surely her drive to reunite with her children was a major factor. However, Rachel did not have the support of an underground railroad to aid her. Rachel's skills must also be considered when measuring her success in her initial escape. And we should remember Rachel's ability to adapt and learn. She may not have considered the importance nature can play in helping one survive the conditions she encountered. But historians have found evidence to suggest that slaves, especially those enslaved in the Deep South, supplemented their meager diets by sourcing local resources from nature, nuts, berries, and local game. Could this have been something Rachel resorted to in order to survive when rations were taken from her? It may have been something she learned from other slaves who themselves had to find ways to supplement their meager diets. In her second escape, and without much from nature, she still endures. And though the changing of the seasons created a challenge, surely the success of her first escape provided the encouragement that she could meet any obstacle to survive. And unlike in her first escape, this time she was able to encounter those willing to provide the aid and shelter and food to sustain her. She was also able to make it to a free state through much shorter distances. But regardless, we must recognize that it's just remarkable, right? Remarkable that Rachel survived this journey, multiple journeys. And though she was unsuccessful reuniting with her children, that didn't deter her from trying. And then, of course, she made it to Canada. Excuse me. So my last story that I want to share is probably the most graphic in detail. And I will be dealing with some themes of both trauma and sexual abuse. And these are not easy subjects to discuss. And it'll be important for understanding the facts of the story. If at any time, if you feel uncomfortable, if you'd like to walk out the room, give yourself a few minutes, I completely understand. Take a moment. But like with Eliza's story, I'll be pulling from several sources to share the story of a woman first known as Peggy Garner, or as Levi and others who witnessed her trials knew her as Margaret Garner. I'll be referring to her as Margaret, a name she chose to take in her hopes of a free life. I do want to state that Levi and Catharine had no direct contact with Margaret and the family of slaves she escaped with, unlike the three that I spoke of before. However, if events had happened differently, Levi, at the minimum, would have played a part in the family's escape from Cincinnati. Unlike many in Levi's book, there is quite a bit known about Margaret's life. Peggy, which was her slave name, or Margaret, was born on June 4th, 1833 in Richwood, Kentucky. So here's another of my maps that I like to draw from. This really helps me sort of understand geography, and really with the Underground Railroad especially. And so where you see that red dot there in the bottom left, that is where Richwood, Kentucky is. So again, not far from the Ohio River. She was born to an enslaved mother named Scylla and was property at first of a man named John Pollard Gaines. Margaret then became property of his brother, Archibald Gaines. So I have a picture here of this gentleman. And the Maplewood farm where Archibald lived with his slaves in Richwood, Kentucky, there's still, there's still a summer kitchen that would have been attached to a much larger house, but either that larger house burned down or something happened, but it's not standing, but the summer kitchen still is. And this could be possibly a space where Margaret spent time. And we know with Margaret's situation, she was both doing farm chore duties as well as house duties, as well as raising her own children. Margaret, by the age of 23, she had given birth to 4 children and considered herself married to an enslaved man, Robert Garner. Robert, along with his parents, were property of a Gaines neighbor, James Marshall. On January 27th, 1856, Robert, Margaret, their 4 children, and Robert's parents all escaped Richwood for Cincinnati, Ohio. With the details provided by Levi Coffin, the group made their crossing over the Ohio River in broad daylight. Upon their arrival in the city, they immediately worked to find the home of a black man by the name of Kite. Due to the fact that they did not know the home's location, on several occasions the group had to ask local residents for directions, but eventually made it to Kite's home. Kite was not sure how or what to do for the family, recognizing they could not remain long. Kite knew Levi Coffin and left his home that morning to ask Coffin's advice. Levi instructed Kite to take the family as quickly as he could to a black settlement north of the city. Levi would make arrangements for transportation to get them further north. Kite left Coffin and returned home, only to shortly after have his home attacked by a group of men looking for the family. The Kites and the Garners refused to let them in, ready to fight if needed. As the fight to get into the home ensued, Levi states that Margaret, quote, declared that she would kill herself and her children before she would return to bondage. As Margaret saw the posse of men get through into the house, she grabbed a nearby butcher knife and cut the neck of her youngest child, a daughter. Next, she attempted to kill her other children, only to be stopped by the very men who invaded the house. Her youngest, a daughter, did not survive the attack. The Garners were arrested and put on trial, a trial that Levi witnessed. though it was a 2-week trial, and I'm not quite sure how much he really witnessed, but he mentions being there. This is a image called the modern Medea, which was created to show this moment of these men entering the home and showing that Margaret had killed her child. The trial, according to Levi, has spurred much activity amongst the anti-slavery supporters and the free Black population of the city, and drew crowds each day. The Garner family were put on trial as runaway slaves for breaking federal law. But Margaret Garner also faced state murder charges due to the killing of her child. And despite having the best abolitionist lawyers in Cincinnati, which included this man, John Jolliffe, so anytime a slave was caught in Cincinnati and was put on trial, John tried to step in and provide what legal defense he could for these individuals. And he actually tried to get the Garners off the charges of escaping slavery by saying that most of the adult Garners, which included Margaret, actually had been brought to Cincinnati and lived for short periods. And Ohio law at the time said if you did that, your slaves were free. You could not live with slave property in Ohio. But unfortunately, it was not a defense of it was not a judge, by the way, that heard this. It was a commissioner because of the way the Fugitive Law of 1850. It was not heard by judges. Despite having the best lawyers, the Garners were found guilty of escape and charged with returning to slavery in Kentucky. As for the murder charges, I'm going to come back to that. So hold on to hear what happens there. Levi does not speak much as to what happened post-trial to Margaret, other than she and the others were taken to Covington, Kentucky, which is opposite the river of Cincinnati, put on a riverboat to head further south. Levi notes, quote, "It was reported that on her way down the river, she sprang from the boat into the water with her babe in her arms, with one of her living children. Then when she rose, she was seized by some of the boat hands and rescued, but that her child was drowned." Levi gives many of the base facts of Margaret's experience, but there are several things that Levi does not mention or really dig into. And Margaret's story and that of her family has been researched to try and understand several aspects, including why Margaret chose to kill her child. The public's reactions to Margaret's trial, as some saw her as a hero and others as a villain, due to her efforts to harm her children, or really understanding the situation the Garners tried to escape from. Howard University African-American history professor Nikki M. Taylor has worked to explore the full story in her book, which is called Driven Towards Madness: The Fugitive Slave Margaret Garner and the Tragedy on the Ohio. As Taylor writes in her book, Margaret's story, though traumatic, is important to share. First off, Margaret was the only enslaved person to be able to testify at a hearing under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. So generally under the law, as a fugitive slave, you do not get to defend yourself. You do not get to testify on your own behalf. But for some reason, the commissioner who was hearing the trial and making the decision on what to do about the Garners allowed Margaret to testify. Taylor also highlights how Garner was celebrated by abolitionists in the 1850s as the first female African-American to use violent resistance to keep from being returned to slavery. Along with Margaret's testimony, there were also interviews of both her husband, Robert, and his parents, who helped to fill in the details of what really happened inside the Kite home. Using the details from the interviews, it is apparent that Robert's mother, Mary, was the only one to witness Margaret's attack on the youngest of her children. In fact, Margaret implored Mary to help her, of which she refused, instead choosing to run to a nearby bedroom and hide under a bed. Soon after, Mary was joined by the 2 Garner boys, Margaret's 2 sons, who had just freed themselves from their mother's attempt to kill them. The knife was finally taken from Margaret by Kite's wife, but Margaret did not let that stop her. With another daughter nearby, Margaret grabbed a coal shovel and struck her living daughter in the head. In the next moment, Margaret was captured, and despite her attempts, the daughter she had just attacked did survive. So she, in that process, again, just the one daughter had died. Taylor does much to explore how Margaret came to wish death of her children. In interviews done with Margaret and in the time she spent in the public eye in court, it is apparent that Margaret could not accept the idea of returning to slavery. Some have tried to claim that Margaret was mentally unstable. No one in this period of history could fathom why a person would attack their own helpless children. Newspapers painted Margaret as a woman who lacked maternal affections for her children. though the actions seen in the courtroom. So when her trial was happening, Margaret was in the courtroom with her children, holding her daughter, the daughter that she just literally struck days before, her 2 sons playing nearby. And despite people's feeling that she lacked these maternal affections, Margaret cradled her daughter, played with her daughter, tended to her sons, which showing that obviously is painting a different picture. Interviews with Margaret outside the courtroom shows that she believed she knew what was best for her children, claiming she had maternal authority over them, even though the law at the time saw her children as another man's property. Margaret tried her best to create a better situation for her children by escaping, remarking that the family had, quote, fled in fear. Margaret made another statement that slavery for her were, quote, nights of unmitigated toil. Though she did not go into further detail about why, it is evident that for Margaret, slavery meant a long, agonizing life akin to a slow and torturous death. With the potential of capture before her, Margaret determined that death was a better condition than life in slavery for her children. Several confirmed that she seemed satisfied knowing one of her children was now with God and no longer enslaved. Today, as Margaret's situation as an enslaved woman has been studied, it is not hard to determine some possibilities of why Margaret acted as she did. The easiest theory to pose is Margaret suffered from trauma due to her life as an enslaved woman, though it must be stated that there are no specifics of what Margaret meant by unmitigated toil. So she never went into detail of what her actual experiences were like. But her words show that Margaret feared further hardship. In physical descriptions written about Margaret, it was clear that she bore physical scars, such as 2 on her face. When asked in court about the scars, all Margaret said was, "White man struck me." Physical mistreatment by the hand could not create such scarring. Margaret's husband, Robert, and his parents also shared that physical abuse and inadequate provisions was experienced while enslaved under James Marshall. Like Margaret, they also carried physical scars. And later actions by Archibald Gaines, the man who owns Margaret and her children, post-trial showed that he had a penchant towards violence, literally physically attacking other people himself, which leads you to feel that if he would do that with strangers on the street, there's no reason to believe he wouldn't do that with his own property. Another possibility must include the theory that Margaret was sexually abused. Abolitionist Lucy Stone, who was one individual to interview Margaret, had a chance to testify as a character witness for Margaret. Stone implied the possibility that Margaret's enslaver, Gaines, may have been a father of several of Margaret's children. Though statements such as this were considered salacious at the time, neither Gaines or his lawyer took the time in court to claim on the record that this accusation was false. But Taylor does make the point in her book that if this situation was true, we can only imagine the fear she felt to be forced back into a situation to live and work alongside a man who potentially was both a rapist and abuser to Margaret. So what came of the trial of both Margaret and her family? Despite the work of their lawyers, who I talked about before, to try to prove that the Garners should be free, the federal commissioner ruled that they were all to be returned to their enslavers. The lawyers did hope they could still help Margaret, since the state of Ohio entered charges of murder against her. If found guilty, then Margaret faced jail time and could not return to Kentucky. But through certain technicalities and delays, which included returning Margaret to Gaines's possession in Kentucky, as a result, a murder trial never happened. All the Garners were sent further south by riverboat, just as Levi says in the book. But the details of what really happened on the riverboat is different factually than what Levi speaks to. What actually happened is their riverboat crashed into another. I don't know if this happened in the Ohio River or later in the Mississippi River, but supposedly Margaret was holding her surviving daughter in her lap, and when that riverboat collision happened, they were both knocked into the water, and her daughter did drown. Margaret survived. She was pulled from the water, but the baby was gone. So the last anyone knew, Margaret and the others were carried on to New Orleans, and that's where their story ends. We just don't know what happened after that. So in conclusion, all 4 of these stories are connected by a woman's need to be with her children and family. Enslaved women legally had nothing to call their own, no possessions, no autonomy over their own bodies, and not the children they bore. Despite whatever roadblocks that existed, these women were willing to risk it all, even their lives, if it meant being able to remain a family. But not all these stories had the same endings. Unlike Ede and Margaret, who appeared to have remained in slavery, Eliza and Rachel were successful in their escape. One major factor in this success was the access to the Underground Railroad and its operatives who helped during parts of their journey toward freedom. Ede's story takes place during a time in North Carolina before there were real organized efforts of what we could call the Underground Railroad. Yet Ede was not concerned with leaving the state. Her wish was just to remain with her family. If one variable to Ede's story had changed, let's say it happened 10 years later when there was more of an organized effort, and Ede was offered a chance to escape to a state like Indiana, would she have taken that chance? If it meant her children could go with her, I think so, yes. But if not, Ede wanted to be where her children were. Margaret and her family hoped the Underground Railroad was an option and were only hours away from connecting with someone who could provide that window of opportunity, only to have that window shut and unthinkable events take place. Surely, Margaret did not go into this escape imagining the outcome that happened. Yet for her, her split-second decision was one she felt was the only way to provide true freedom for her children. For her, it was not just freedom from slavery, but from what she imagined was a long and traumatic life and really a slow death. Even though we can see Rachel's escape as successful, we must remember that she was willing to escape on her own to reunite with her children, even if that meant her death. The Underground Railroad may have seemed only like a possibility if she could reach Kentucky again. She was close to a possible reunion only to have it taken from her. Regardless of her capture, she chose to take her fate in her own hands again. Perhaps she became resigned that she had truly lost her children forever. But she knew a return to Mississippi meant potential torture and perhaps death. So why not risk another escape? This time, Rachel was able to find her way to those with knowledge of the mysterious road, as Levi would say, and eventually found a free life in Canada. Eliza's story really is the outlier of the four. An enslaved mother who escapes across a half-frozen river with a young child who happened to arrive in a free state near one of the most active Underground Railroad homes in Ohio, which put her on a journey that brought she and her child eventually to Canada. It is almost as if the story writes itself, right? So it makes a good story. Anything, though, could have gone wrong. Capture before crossing the Ohio River, the drowning of she and her child, or Chancey Shaw if his decision is like, nope, you're coming with me. Is Eliza's story one of luck or maybe divine intervention? Rachel's story is also one where perhaps a little luck allowed her to find success. Regardless, we can say it is a story of a mother's determination to see herself and her child in freedom despite the risk of death. Many enslaved women were unwilling to go as far as these four to chance escape. The risk of escaping on their own was great enough. By adding just one child in the plan of escape meant their needs and unpredictable nature were potential handicaps. Many chose to stay behind for their children. Women were not to be selfless and not put their needs first. If you are a good mother, you don't abandon your children. Even in Coffin's book, you often see stories of men, not women, choosing to escape. But for these four, leaving their children behind must have been unimaginable. Separation was one variable that drove enslaved mothers like Ede, Eliza, and Rachel into action. Though Margaret did not face separation, she decided to protect her children from a life of potential abuse and mistreatment. All four made their decisions because they were mothers. Even though legally these children were not theirs, these mothers refused to give up on the notion that they had a family. Something they were told they could not possess. Something else that could not be taken from them was a feeling of responsibility for that family, that those children belonged to them. And if freedom could not be found beyond the river, then freedom through death was an acceptable fate. Any questions? It's a little heavy. I apologize.
No, it was good.
Thank you. Any thoughts, reflections?
You're some brave women. That's where you go. Chew your own kid.
And that's something that even today in modern society, we look at this and think, how could a parent do that to a child? And so
the fate of being enslaved would be a close.
Is it? Might as well be there as to be
being in the arms of the Lord instead of being abused. And was she the one that was raped? And
So especially if she had faced that much abuse, that's why she's life. Yeah. I don't want my kids to experience those. Exactly.
They wasn't selfish because they done everything they could up here.
Well, right. And I think that's, Rachel felt she couldn't, if I stay in this situation, or not Rachel, excuse me, Margaret felt that if we stay in this position, I can't protect them. The only way I can protect them is if we leave.
So no place in Indiana had slaves. I know you're saying it's a free state, but
No. So yes, there was, even up until the 1820 census, we still have records of slaves in Indiana. Yes.
but it's just where you're going. I thought she was trying to get from Kentucky to Ohio, and then the girl was in Ohio. She was a slave. So.
I know. Well, when I was mentioning when the Garners, the defense in the trial, is that what you're speaking to, Marlene? So in areas like Cincinnati, especially because of just the commerce of the area, right? Cincinnati was like the gateway from the north to the south and vice versa in trade. So it wasn't unusual for enslavers to either, well, in Margaret's situation, if I remember right, she was asked to nurse another woman that was living in Cincinnati or somewhere in Ohio, and it was like for 6 months. And then I believe it was her husband and her husband's father who were sent to Cincinnati fairly often for business purposes, because the Gaineses, I believe, raised hogs, and then hogs went to Cincinnati, right? So you went to Cincinnati to make your deals. And so so even the men in their defense said, you know, in the interviews, they said, yeah, we were brought to Cincinnati by our enslavers. We spent time here. So the idea of the lawyer is, well, that should show that they should have freedom, because you cannot. Indiana basically said, the Supreme Court said in the Polly Strong case, you cannot live here, own property, live in, you know, pay taxes here and be a slave owner, because we're a free state. I don't know how much of that defense came up in Indiana cases, but at least in Cincinnati, where you have this continual relationship and commerce, I think that was a fairly common defense that was being used at that time. Doesn't mean it always worked. It all depended on the commissioner that you were speaking to. That's a big part of it. But it is remarkable that Margaret, as it says in this book, was the only male or female to ever be given the opportunity to defend herself in front of a commissioner. That would not have been allowed, generally.
Well, I enjoyed it. I'm not a reader. I don't read books.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed that.
Okay, good. Plus, it gives me a chance, again, to sort of think of these stories beyond those pages. I mean, Levi's provided us a baseline to look at. What more can we learn about these individuals? And I've spent some time with Eliza's story on a previous project, and I got to, in Margaret, just because of, I mean, this woman's, those 2 weeks in the newspapers, and I mean, everything's, I shouldn't say everything's recorded, but with Rachel and Ede, you know, there's only so far I can take those specific stories. We don't know where Rachel was enslaved in Mississippi. We'll probably never know. So
I think it was interesting to hear about the women, because I think, like you said, generally men escape, and all you hear is about them.
is the men. Yeah.
That was interesting.
Yeah. And I thought about telling a story of one who escaped, made it successfully to Canada, but felt guilty because he left his family behind and decided to go back to Kentucky and help in their escape. And supposedly that escape was successful. 14 people, according to Levi, is what he came back with in his second return. But again, it's phenomenal. To be able to do it once, and to do it once successfully, is remarkable. And then in Rachel's case, to have a second chance opportunity, your success rates go down demonstrably the longer your situation is so untenable. So, well, thank you all for coming this evening. I appreciate your time.